somewhere between Jerusalem and the southern end of the Red Sea. A queen once loaded a caravan with gold, spices, and precious stones, and set out to test the wisdom of a king she'd only heard about in stories. That's the version most people know. A queen, a king, a riddle contest, a romance implied but never confirmed. But here's what almost never makes it into the story. This might be the greatest case of mistaken identity in ancient history. Not because the story is fake, because the woman at the center of it may not be one woman at all. For centuries, historians assumed there was a single queen to find. One real ruler, one real kingdom, one correct answer waiting somewhere in the sand.
Archaeologists have spent decades chasing that answer across 3 completely different regions of the ancient world.
And each one has produced real evidence: inscriptions, temples, portraits carved in stone. Each one, on its own, looks convincing. And each one, when you check the dates against each other, turns out to rule the others out. So which region actually produced her? Or is the real answer less about archaeology and more about who needed her to be theirs? Let's follow the evidence, region by region, and find out. The oldest written version of this story comes from the Hebrew Bible, in the first book of Kings. A queen from a place called Sheba hears of Solomon's wisdom and wealth and travels to Jerusalem to test him with hard questions. She arrives with an enormous caravan, camels loaded with spices, gold, and precious stones. And after Solomon answers everything she asks, the text says she was left breathless, with no more spirit in her. She gives him gifts, receives gifts in return, and returns home. That's essentially the entire account. No name, no physical description, no explanation of exactly where Sheba was, beyond the implication that it was far away and extremely wealthy. The Quran tells a fuller version of the same core story, in Surat An-Naml. Here she has a name in later Islamic tradition, Bilqis Bond, and a throne, a court, and advisors. The hoopoe bird brings King Solomon news of a powerful queen who rules a magnificent kingdom and worships the sun. Solomon sends her a letter. She consults her council. She travels to meet him, and along the way there's a famous test involving her throne. And a floor that looks like water but isn't. A trick designed to test her perception and her wisdom, which she passes. In most tellings, she recognizes Solomon's God as the true one and submits to it. For most of the last 2,000 years, both traditions have pointed toward the same general region, global safety lock, the ancient kingdom of Saba, in the southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, roughly where Yemen is today. This isn't a random guess. Saba was real. Sabaean inscriptions, monumental dams, and temple ruins confirm a sophisticated, wealthy civilization that controlled the incense trade, frankincense and myrrh, some of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world. For centuries. If you wanted a queen rich enough to arrive in Jerusalem with a caravan full of gold,
for a long time, that seemed to settle it. Case closed. Global safety lock. The Sabaean kingdom is a completely reasonable place to look, and plenty of serious historians still favor it. Sheba was Saba, Saba was Yemen, and the rest was just detail. Except the Sabaean king list that survives doesn't clearly include a reigning queen.
Around the traditional date usually given for Solomon, somewhere in the 10th century BC. Sabaean traders, settlers, and religious influence had already crossed onto the African shore, centuries before Solomon supposedly sat on his throne.
Which means the search for Sheba doesn't have to stop at the Arabian coastline. It can cross the water.
Before we go there, it's worth asking a different question than the one everyone starts with. Not which kingdom produced her, but which kingdoms had the most to gain by claiming her?
Because as we're about to see, that second question turns out to matter more than the archaeology alone. The first kingdom to make the claim doesn't just challenge the Arabian theory. It claims the queen by name.
In Ethiopian tradition, the queen has a name, Makeda.
And she isn't just a footnote in someone else's story. She's the founding figure of an entire royal line. The source for this is the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings, Ethiopia's national epic.
In it, Makeda travels to Jerusalem, is impressed by Solomon,
and returns home pregnant with his son, Menelik. Menelik later travels to Jerusalem himself, is acknowledged by his father, and, in the epic's most audacious claim, returns to Ethiopia with the Ark of the Covenant itself, which Ethiopian tradition holds is still kept, to this day, in a guarded chapel in the town of Aksum. This story became the ideological foundation of Ethiopia's Solomonic dynasty, which ruled, with interruptions, for centuries. Here's where most retellings of this story get something wrong, and it's worth slowing down to fix it. The Kebra Nagast is very frequently described as the Aksumite claim to Sheba. And Aksum, the famous kingdom of stone obelisks and later Christian churches, is real and extraordinary. But the kingdom of Aksum didn't exist yet in Solomon's time. The archaeological consensus places Aksum's rise around the 1st century BC at the earliest.
Many centuries after Solomon is traditionally dated.
If Makeda ruled in the 10th century BC, she wasn't ruling from Aksum.
She would have belonged to an earlier, much less famous kingdom, Dumt.
Demt is one of the more overlooked civilizations in this entire story. Centered in the highlands of what's now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, with a major religious and possibly political center at Yeha, Dumat flourished roughly between the 10th and 5th centuries BC.
A window that lines up remarkably well with the traditional date for Solomon.
At Yeha, a monumental temple still stands today, built in a style directly borrowed from South Arabian, Sabaean architecture.
Dedicated to the god Al-Maqa, the same god worshipped across the water in Saba. The inscriptions found there are written in a script adapted from Sabaean writing. This wasn't an isolated African kingdom independently inventing wealth and power.
It was a civilization deeply entangled with the Sabaean world across the Red Sea, sharing its religion, its script, and very likely its trade networks. So does that make Makeda real and dumped her kingdom? Not exactly, and this is important. The Kebra Nagast wasn't written down in anything like its current form until the 14th century AD, more than 2,000 years after the events it describes, explicitly to legitimize a specific royal dynasty's claim to divine and Solomonic descent. That's not evidence of a historical Makeda. That's evidence of a powerful origin myth, written for a political purpose, centuries after the fact. What the archaeology at Yeha does give us is something almost as interesting, though. Proof that a real, wealthy, Sabaean-connected kingdom existed on the African side of the Red Sea, at exactly the right moment in time to have produced someone like the Queen in the legend. Even if we can't put a name or a face to her. Right timing, right trade connections, right region. For a moment, this looks like the strongest case in the entire investigation. Then you cross the border into Sudan, and the case gets a lot more complicated. But Ethiopia isn't the only civilization with a reason to claim her. Just west of it, along the Nile, archaeologists have found a case with far more physical proof behind it, and a far bigger problem hiding in the fine print. If Ethiopia gives us the right timing, but a thin paper trail, this claim offers almost the opposite problem: overwhelming, spectacular evidence attached to the wrong century. Further south and west, along the Nile, in what's now Sudan, the Kingdom of Kush built one of the most underappreciated power centers of the ancient world. At its Nile-side capital of Meroe, the Kushites raised more pyramids than Egypt itself, over 200 of them, smaller and steeper than their Egyptian counterparts, but staggering in sheer number. And starting in the last centuries BC, Kush was ruled, again and again, by women who held power in their own right. Not as regents standing in for absent kings, but as sovereigns. Their title was Kandake, Latinized later as Candace, and it wasn't a name. It was a royal office, closer in meaning to Queen Mother or ruling queen. The most famous Kandake, Amanirenas, is one of the great underdog stories of ancient military history. The trouble started with a tax. Around 25 BC, shortly after Rome absorbed Egypt, the Roman prefect began levying tribute on territory the Kushites considered their own. Amanirenas didn't wait to be invaded. She and her son, the Crown Prince Akinidad, struck first, leading Kushite forces north to raid the Roman-held towns of Aswan, Philae, and Syene, and famously toppling a bronze statue of the Emperor Augustus in the process. Rome answered with Gaius Petronius, prefect of Egypt, who marched south with a reported 10,000 troops, pushed deep into Kushite territory, and sacked Napata and Tuz.
the kingdom's old religious capital, burning its temple to the god Amun to the ground. It should have been the end of the war. Instead, Amanirenas regrouped. Roman sources describe her afterward as a fierce, one-eyed commander. The eye reportedly lost in the fighting, and 2 years later she marched a second army north and laid siege to the Roman garrison Petronius had left behind at Primis. The siege dragged on long enough and cost Rome enough that Augustus himself agreed to negotiate. The resulting peace treaty, signed at Samos, fixed the frontier well north of Kush's heartland, cancelled the disputed tribute, and held for roughly 3 centuries, an extraordinary outcome against the same empire that would go on to swallow most of the known world. There's one detail that captures the spirit of that war better than any battle description. Decades later, archaeologists excavating in Meroe found a bronze head of Augustus, the same statue Amanirenas' raiders had torn down at the war's opening. Deliberately buried under the entrance steps of a Kushite temple, positioned so that anyone walking in would step on the face of Rome's emperor. For as long as the temple stood, it's now in the British Museum. Her successors kept building pyramids, kept ruling as Kandakes, and kept commanding real armies for hundreds of years afterward. It's easy to see why the Kandakes get pulled into the Sheba conversation. They're exactly the kind of figure the legend describes. Independently wealthy, politically formidable, commanding respect on the international stage, unmistakably in charge. If you were designing a queen from scratch to match the confidence and authority. In the biblical and Quranic accounts, a Kandake of Meroe would be a strong template. But, and this is the piece that responsible history has to include, the timeline doesn't work. And it doesn't work by a wide margin. The earliest confirmed Kandakes appear in the historical and archaeological record around the 2nd century BC. Amanirenas herself ruled roughly 800 to 900 years after Solomon's traditional dates. That's not a small discrepancy that can be waved away. It's the difference between the Roman Empire and today. No Kandake could have personally traveled to Solomon's Jerusalem, because Solomon's Jerusalem was already ancient history by the time the office of Kandake existed. So if the Kandakes weren't Sheba, why do they keep coming up in this conversation? The honest answer may be less about a single misidentified queen, and more about what the Kandakes represent, proof that the model of a powerful, independent African queen, commanding wealth, armies, and international respect, wasn't an isolated exception invented by storytellers. It was a real, recurring political reality along the Nile for centuries. The Kandakes may not be Sheba, but they're evidence that Sheba, a legendary, formidable queen from the south, the Kumans, was describing a type of ruler that genuinely existed in this part of the world, again and again. Long after any single Sheba would have lived and died. An even older tradition enters the story here. And it comes with the earliest hard evidence of all. Carved in stone half a millennium before Solomon was even born. Egyptian pharaohs had been trading for generations with a distant, wealthy land. They simply called God's land. The clearest record of that relationship survives on the walls of a great temple built for the female pharaoh Hatshepsut, showing a major trading expedition she sent out in the 15th century BC. Ships, cargo, and the foreign rulers who greeted her emissaries, all carved in careful detail. Those carvings name a local king and queen, and the queen is shown in a way no other royal woman is anywhere else in Egyptian art. Heavier set, rendered almost like a real portrait rather than an idealized goddess. Some Egyptologists read it as one of the only physical likenesses we have of an actual foreign queen from this world, rather than an artistic stand-in. The ships came home loaded with myrrh, ivory, gold, exotic animal skins, and live frankincense trees, transplanted roots, and all into the temple gardens. Possibly the first successful attempt in history to transplant a foreign species for cultivation. For decades, nobody could agree on where this kingdom actually was. Recent science has narrowed it down. Isotope analysis on hair from mummified pet baboons. Almost certainly brought back alive from these very expeditions, points strongly toward the Horn of Africa, roughly the region of modern Eritrea, Djibouti, and Somalia, which puts this kingdom in the same broad Red Sea corridor that would, centuries later, connect to Dumt and eventually Aksum. But the timeline here is the most extreme of the three. This expedition happened roughly 5 centuries before Solomon's traditional reign, an entire civilization's worth of time earlier. Whoever this queen really was, she couldn't have been the one who met Solomon. She belongs to a far older chapter of the same story. Proof that this stretch of coastline was producing wealthy, powerful, unforgettable queens 1,000 years before the Bible ever got around to writing one of them into scripture. So, line the 3 claims up, and the picture that emerges isn't a mystery with one hidden answer. It's a mystery that was never going to have a single answer in the first place. Dumt fits the timeline almost perfectly,
but leaves us almost no individual evidence. No name, no portrait, no personal record, only a temple and an inscription tradition that proves a wealthy, Sabaean-connected kingdom existed in exactly the right place and time. The Kandakes of Kush give us exactly the personality and power the legend describes. A real, recurring pattern of formidable, independent queens. But they belong to a period nearly a millennium too late to have personally met Solomon. Punt gives us the earliest and richest physical record of all. Ships, cargo, a named king and queen carved in stone. But it sits 5 centuries too early, an ancient memory even by Solomon's time. None of them, individually, satisfies every condition the legend requires. And once you notice that, a different and arguably more interesting explanation starts to take shape. The Red Sea, from at least the time of Punt through the age of the Kandakes, was not 3 separate, disconnected stories. It was one long, continuous corridor of trade, migration, and cultural exchange, linking the Arabian Peninsula to the Horn of Africa and the Nile Valley for roughly 2,000 years. Incense routes, shared deities like Al-Maqa, shared scripts, and intermarried elites moved across that water constantly, in both directions. For centuries before and after Solomon supposedly lived. Powerful, wealthy queens weren't a one-time anomaly in this world. They were, again and again, exactly the kind of ruler this region produced. At Punt in the 15th century BC, quite possibly at Domant around Solomon's own time, and unmistakably at Meroe for hundreds of years afterward. A story, like the meeting of Solomon and Sheba, passed down first, orally, and then in scripture over hundreds of years, doesn't need to be reporting on one single event with photographic accuracy. It may be doing something else entirely. Notice what all 3 claims actually have in common. Ethiopia didn't just preserve a folk tale about Makeda. It built an entire royal dynasty's legitimacy on her, all the way into the 20th century. The Kebra Nagast wasn't written to record history. It was written to prove a king's right to rule. The Kush connection resurfaces every time historians want to explain where Sheba's confidence and authority could have come from. Even the Punt theory only gained traction once scholars realized Egypt's oldest trading partner fit the profile of a fabulously wealthy foreign queen, better than almost anyone else in the region. In other words, this was never simply a cold case waiting for someone to find the right body of evidence. It was a prize. For 3,000 years, every powerful kingdom along the Red Sea corridor has had a reason to want her. Because whoever gets to claim the Queen of Sheba
gets to claim a piece of Solomon's glory for themselves.
For 3,000 years, kingdoms didn't just search for the Queen of Sheba.
They searched for the right to inherit her story.
History didn't fail to preserve the Queen of Sheba.
It preserved too many claims on her to ever let her go. Maybe the greatest case of mistaken identity in ancient history was never about which queen was real. It was about how many kingdoms needed to be mistaken for her home.